All ordered systems tend to disorder in the absence of care. Like my truck, which requires constant maintenance. Most cars do. The most basic of this is the engine oil. It goes into the top of the engine, comes out the bottom, then gets sucked out of this pan, the sump, and repeats the journey. Engines have lots of moving parts. Crankshaft bearings, camshaft bearings, push rods, pistons, and so on. All these parts are metal, and metal generates a lot of friction. A constant stream of oil keeps them from deforming. But if the oil keeps getting cycled through, why does it have to be replaced every 5,000 miles? Because it degrades. Why does it degrade? Engine oil is comprised of two things, a base oil and additives. The base oil is the bulk of the material and generally handles the whole lubrication job. Oils are hydrocarbons, molecules made from hydrogen and carbon atoms that are extracted by boiling crude oil. These are directly used as the basis for conventional motor oil, or are artificially modified to form the base for a synthetic oil. Unless that synthetic oil uses a synthetically generated group 4 or group 5 base, I wouldn't know. These are industry secrets. Point is, these things are pretty stable when they're just sitting there in a vacuum, not touching anything. In an engine, they're touching all sorts of things, things we want them to touch, things we don't want them to touch, getting all hot and steamy, being near explosions all day. And I meant steamy literally. One of the things we don't want our oil touching is water and air, or anything containing oxygen, including hydroxyl, the hose of the hydrocarbon world. See, both hydrogen and carbon like being with oxygen more than they like being with each other. When these oxygen-containing molecules are present, they start swapping atoms around like Pokemon cards at recess. Eventually, the hydrogen is ripped away from the carbon chain, oxygen replaces it, and you're left with carbon dioxide and water. Neither make good lubricants. When these get into the oil, they cause the fluid to become more viscous and gradually turn into sludge. They can also make the oil acidic, which corrodes metal, which the engine is made of. The only way this could be worse is if it's occurring in a hot environment. Heat acts as an accelerant for these chemical reactions. While synthetic oils might be more resistant to these processes and to high temperatures, they'll still succumb in the end. We can slow down this degradation by adding a bunch of compounds to these base oils, creatively called additives. These are meant to be consumed in order to prevent wear, prevent sludge from forming, and help stabilize the viscosity. They can delay the inevitable failure of the oil, but only so far. Eventually they run out. A bunch of random contaminants also infiltrate over time, like dirt, water, and metal particles. There's the oil filter to keep this stuff out of the engine, but it can only stop so much. Long story short, your oil can only be oil for so long. Change it. The process, thankfully, is simple. There's a bolt at the bottom of the drain pan called the drain plug. If you remove it, the oil drains out. There's usually a crush washer on this bolt that acts as a gasket to stop the oil from dripping out. You want to replace this whenever you take the bolt out to make sure that you get a good seal when you reinstall it. You can see here that my used oil is pretty nasty. I may have run it a bit too long. Next, you replace the oil filter. It is a filter. It can only hold so much gunk before it starts acting as a plug. You need a tool to wrench it loose, and then you can unscrew it. So it's probably full of oil. That's spilling oil. So you might want the drip pan there so it doesn't splatter all over you and the parking spot. Make sure you get the right size replacement, pre-fill it a bit, and rub some fresh, transparent oil around the gasket. Then screw it in by hand. Finally, go back to the top of the engine and fill it with new oil. I'm using 5-weight 30 because that's what the manual says to use. Your car may be different, probably is. If you have a dipstick, you can use that to check the oil level. And make sure there is oil in the engine. Trying to run the engine without any oil, running it dry, will be very, very bad. In terms of the oil change interval, you used to have to do it every 3,000 miles. Now you can go 5,000, even 10,000 miles between changes depending on what your oil analysis results are. Which measure how much the oil has degraded, how many of the additive compounds were used up. I would start at 5,000 miles and go from there, gradually testing and increasing that interval. Apparently, some modern cars use machine learning algorithms to predict how far you can drive before you need an oil change. I was given the recommendation to have whatever value is spat out. Personally, I probably would. All right. Now that the oil's done, I've just got to do all the other fluids and a bunch of other wear parts. Maintenance is important. Vehicles are way nicer when they work.